Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure welcoming Dr. Sucharita Sengupta for an interactive session on dialogue amid catastrophe, the case of climate change. Dr. Sucharita Sengupta is an assistant professor, Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She graduated from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. She has completed her MA, M.Phil and PhD from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has previously worked with the Indian Express, Chandigarh, the Energy and Resources Institute, University of Pennsylvania Institute for Advanced Study of India, and Indraprastha College of Women, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest include climate politics, urban studies, and gender. You're welcome, Dr. Sengupta. You have up to 2 hours for this session, and you're welcome to conduct it however you like to. So over to you, ma'am. And you can share your screen. And one reminder to the participants, please keep your cameras on throughout the session, all of you. Okay, ma'am, we can begin. Thank you.
A very good afternoon, everyone. A very huge thanks, first of all, to Dr. Fatmi for, um, writing that email to me and inviting me over. And of course, to Dr. Sabyasachi, who I see as a mentor, who was the person who put me in touch with Behzad in the first place. So I'd really like to put my gratitude on record for both of them. Um, I'm absolutely delighted that all of you are going to keep your camera on because as a teacher, I'm uh, tired of talking to a computer screen. So for a change, it's kind of nice to see, who I'm talking to you to. Um, so it- I do understand that this is essentially a program on dialogue where you get to understand different aspects of dialogue. In the interest of transparency, I would like to tell all of you that I am not an expert on dialogue. That's not what I work on. However, I do work on climate politics, and there, some aspects of dialogue are very, very critical, very crucial. In fact, it is, it's central to how the climate discourse, both globally as well as within the state or at local level, national level, how it operates, right? So you will have to forgive me for, errors or any omissions that I make talking about dialogue, but I'm going to try and give insights that make sense to you, that sort of segue very well, which dovetail nicely with the program, so that you take away something from it, which makes sense, which is of use to you, and which probably adds to this conversation about dialogue itself. So that was the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and the title of the lecture is Dialogue Amid Catastrophe, the Case of Climate Change. I really don't know how else to characterize climate change. I don't know. I've been working on this, I mean, since I was in college on aspects of environmental issues, but my PhD was on climate change. So at least from 2006 onwards, I've been working on this issue area. And it was a disaster then, and it is an unmitigated disaster now. So I do understand that there could be a charge, against me or my lecture. Uh, it's very doomsday. It's very pessimistic. But what can I do? That's the nature of the problem. It is a very doomsday type of problem. It is not something that, in all honesty, I can turn around and tell young people like you that, wow, sab kuch theek ho jayega. Is it okay if I'm multilingual? I mean, I only know two languages anyway, but is that all
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Or would you
But I
prefer
think
English?
there are some foreign students as well, so it will be
Okay,
nice.
all right. Okay, fine. Okay, I'll stick to English then. That's not an issue. I'm sorry I had to ask this because when I teach in Jamia, a lot of students request Hindi Urdu, so I
No,
kind of
if
got used to the pattern. But I'm absolutely comfortable with English, so that's not an issue. Um, right. So it is a catastrophe. Unfortunately, anyone talking on climate change, cannot possibly give young people good news. I think that's really difficult. And I think it would not be right also to turn around and say that, we have these solutions on the table and someday it's going to yield wonderful results. No, the catastrophe is all around us to see. In fact, what's interesting is that, around the time when I was just beginning to work on this issue area, the changes were there, but they were not that clearly visible, in terms of massive disasters, B, the coverage was very poor in the media, right? But now I think both the discourse has sharpened, it has become more intense. It's more and more difficult to pretend that this problem doesn't exist. And because of that, media coverage is also higher, but also the intensity of the actual problem has also become more visible. Um, uh, Perhaps, all the participants sitting here, uh, maybe you're already aware of this, but in case you're not, you could go to the IPCC website. The IPCC website usually has the latest report that they produce, that consortium of scientists produce. And of course, if you are from a science background, you could go through it in as great depth as you wish to. But there is an executive summary, and you could look at that executive summary, and a quick glance is going to tell you what the proportion of the disaster is, just to get a sense of how bad the problem is and how deep we are into it. Those of you who are not who are cagey about perhaps reading that much scientific jargon, and you're not entirely comfortable with it, could also use the route of literature. There's a lot of literature, climate literature being produced in India. Most famously, more recently, Mr. Amitav Ghosh has written a wonderful book on it. Of course, he enters it through literary theory, but the essential concern is related to the future of human society, right? So these are some resources that I can throw out off the top of my head, which you can consult in order to get a sense of how catastrophic it is. So I thought it was only fair to you know think about how do we talk about climate issues, something that is so dangerous, so catastrophic, and which is already altering human society at a very, very basic and a very, very fundamental level. Another thing which I would like to say before I start my presentation is that look at the nature of the problem. It is a planetary level problem. Now, a lot of political problems are resolvable at the level of the state. We do that. So much of international relations is about resolving a problem either at the state level or at the international level, inter-national, or at the regional level also. But this is, one of those problems which really, if even a few states opt out of it, it would be very, very difficult to coalesce and get the sort of results you want, either whether it's in terms of what agreements you're coming to, or whether it's in terms of the actual action on the ground that is being taken. So that's a second aspect of the climate problem. And the third aspect of the climate problem is that it's not always visible, it's not always obvious. um, so one has to make a lot of effort. I mean, states, civil society actors, individual human beings at their level will have to make a huge amount of effort just to get a sense of the problem. So these are just a few things that I would like to flag just before I start my presentation. My presentation itself, I would say, is a collation of some very nascent ideas that I have. So my PhD was looking at the domestic actors that do the decision making regarding climate change. And it was a small project. And at that point of time, I found that also very, very difficult to conduct. But over time, I have tried to look at, some other aspects of climate change as well. I've tried to look at social movements. I've tried to see, whether there is any electoral resonance of climate issues. And as always, this is a work in progress. So that's again something that I'd like to point out. Now, I'm just sharing my screen. I'm going to. All right. So I've divided, what I'm going to talk about in about three parts or so, and I'm going to expand upon that. And these are some points, talking points that I have on the screen that all of you can look at, and later we can talk about it in greater detail in the Q&A. Now, in my understanding, a dialogue is or should be some kind of a meaningful conversation among two or more parties. Of course, two parties are minimum, but there could be uh, many more. And when you're talking about climate change, the number of parties are actually um, a huge multitude. It's not a monolith at all. Though, if you look at the academic literature on climate change, it can come across as very monolithic, but it is actually, you do a granular study and you'll realize that the parties are a huge number over here. Now, a dialogue is also usually expected to be a sustained sort of a process over very long periods of time. It also deals with a broad issue, but by that I don't mean to say that there's only one or two talking points. When you discuss a broad issue, every other nuance, every other associated issue, every issue which is an offshoot issue, which is an attendant issue, even a tangential issue, all of these become part of the dialogue. So in that sense, I think, and I do believe that a dialogue, well, perhaps could start with some kind of a structure, but there has to be enough flexibility built into it to incorporate issues that might arise through the process of the dialogue itself. Now, when we are looking at all this, it's very natural that there would be a certain degree of disagreement or conflict, and that would be a central feature of the idea. And if that wasn't the case, perhaps a dialogue would not be needed. If you don't have conflict, if everybody agrees on everything, then there's really not much need of a dialogue except to decide, well, how are we going to proceed on the programmatic agenda. And because there is the element of disagreement, there is the element of conflict, there is the element of multiplicity of interests, there is a great deal of bargaining and negotiations. And this is particularly true when we are talking about the global climate dialogue. Stakeholders come with their bargaining positions. They might alter their bargaining positions. They might not alter their bargaining positions, which is again very, very crucial. And there is a process of continuous negotiation. There's so much literature which simply records the negotiations and how difficult it is. There could be prepositions, and there could be one word or two words over which parties would disagree so hugely that the conversation cannot move forward. So these are generally things that I find existing in any kind of dialogue, but it is particularly true of dialogue around climate change. But for me, the most important aspect of any dialogue ought to be, or is, a certain willingness to come to the table, right? A dialogue cannot start without the parties accepting that, yes, we have a problem, and well, let's talk it out, right? And in order to talk it out, you have to come to the table. And the other aspect associated with this, which I would think would be not just the ability to tell, but perhaps a certain willingness to listen, which is very, very crucial and very rare also. So these two things together, I see as features of a meaningful dialogue. Now, what else? Whenever you have a dialogue, there is naturally the expectation of an outcome. Whatever you do it with the hope that there is going to be some kind of a result coming in from here. And that's the hope on the basis of which we perform this labor of dialogue. And when I say perform the labor of dialogue, I don't mean it in a negative sense at all. I don't mean it as a burden at all. I mean it as work, literary work. It is hard work. However, I would say that the very existence and the persistence of the dialogue process is of greater significance. Now, to dismiss a dialogue, because uh, one cannot immediately see results, that I believe is counterproductive. Sometimes, the results are so slow that they're not immediately visible. They're so incremental, they're so slow that the result is not immediately visible, and that can cause some level of frustration, which one can understand. But to then dismiss the fact of the existence of a dialogue, the hope and the optimism associated with a dialogue, because you are not seeing tangible results immediately, I think that I find very, very problematic. Now, one could go so far as to say that the continuation of the process itself is a significant outcome. Take a look at so many of the political dialogues over decades, that have happened, broken down, happened, broken down, happened, broken down. They could be on a vast range of issues. They could be global dialogue, regional dialogue, dialogues at the level of the state, right? When a dialogue breaks down, the process itself has broken down. Now, if the process itself is to stall, in any case, logically speaking, you are not going to have any outcome whatsoever, right? So, that's why the existence of the process itself, I believe, is a most desirable outcome of dialogue itself. Um, Now, the reason I make this point is because more recently, and by more recently, I'd say about the last 10, 12 years or so, last decade or a little more than that. One of the things that I observed was, just for lack of a better word, a certain disdain, if not outright contempt, towards the idea of conversation itself. And why is that so? For one very specific reason, which is speed. And I think that has to do with the fact that there have been generational changes, there have been, societal changes, the impact of capitalism, which does want instant results for any work, that is done. So anything that moves at a very slow speed is immediately seen as somehow either unproductive. And once it is seen as unproductive, then it is seen as being undesirable. And the minute you put something in the category of undesirable, then it's very easy to be contemptuous of that and to try and look for other type of solutions. And Another explanation, of course, which I've been talking about constantly, is there is an urge for instantly visible results, which could come as a package deal, with a poor understanding or lower acceptance of the ethos and methods by which a democracy works. Right now, this to me is important. I don't think we can even talk about climate change, without really uh, talking about democracy or democratic methods, definitely, um, because you cannot be coming to the table unless you have a basic agreement on a basic normative idea that everyone's important, everyone should have a voice, and this has to be intersectional. It has to cut across a variety of identity groups, so on and so forth. Now, this is something that is hard work, that is going to take time. It takes ages to get people to just say yes, okay, we are willing to come in and have a conversation about this issue, right? It takes so long to do that. And we've seen it in our own country, we've seen it in other countries, that especially I noticed this more post liberalization, um, a certain idea that democracy isn't working. And one reason which is put down as to why democracy is not working is because it's moving so slow, we don't get results. I don't know how many of you do this, but I do this a lot. On social media, I read a lot of comments that come in under various articles. And one of the things which is expressed by a whole lot of people is that uh, there is no result. What is going to happen? What is this move about? We don't care. Politics yields nothing. Democracy yields nothing. Coercive methods might yield more. No, so there is all of this, and increasingly, I find it it's very disturbing and it's very disappointing to see this disdain towards democratic ethos and democratic methods, taking root in a way that people are unwilling to change their mind. And this itself becomes problematic, because then this is a massive challenge to the idea of this conversation and this idea of dialogue itself. And at some level, perhaps, um, one's not happy about it, but at the same time, this is happening. So it is a fact that does need to be acknowledged at the minimum, that there is a certain wariness and there is a certain disappointment with the lack of outcomes. The caveat that I would put over there is that that may not be a problem of democracy per se as an idea, democratic ethos per se as an idea, but multiple other structural problems that might be making it harder and harder for results to come out. It could be the result of social problems, it could be the result of political interests, it could be the result of vested interests, whatever the case might be. One has to acknowledge that there is a certain wariness, there is a certain disappointment with how the life of society is getting better, it's getting worse. And at this point, this wasn't part of my lecture, but I just remember that there's been a recent inequality report, and I'm sure that you've already heard about it. It's been publicized and much has been written about it everywhere. um, Inequality worsens this wariness and disappointment, where you have a tiny elite which seems to be living the high life, uh, seems to not be paying such a huge price for these very fundamental changes, these resource scarcities of multiple types that are happening in society. But middle class onwards, right down to the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, are really, really bearing the brunt of this in a terrible way, in a really terrible way. So I think there might be some merit to that idea, that wariness. The best of ideas can really go down the drain if people don't have faith in those ideas. So you've got to put all of these together as challenges, as to why there is a certain, perhaps a frustration with the idea of dialogue. I have some concluding remarks, which of course I'll come to later, but just hold on to this thought for a while. Now, keeping all this in mind, these ideas about dialogues, the positives, the negatives, how do we contextualize the existing dialogue around the question of climate change and its debilitating impacts against some of these features? Now, that's the point I'm hoping I'll make over the next 20-25 minutes, that I hope to be able to offer some insights, if not any strong conclusions, on this particular issue. The next section of my presentation is something that I have titled Catastrophe and the Anthropocene. You have seen the catastrophe unfolding in front of your very eyes. I'm sure all of you, as young people, are um, always looking for greater information. I'm sure you're on social media. More than traditional media, social media does put out both text as well as images of the disastrous consequences of climate change from all over the world. So that should not be anything new for any of you. But in case you haven't really seen, I would urge you to go and see some videos. They're extremely disturbing to watch, they're very upsetting to watch, they're not fun at all. There's nothing soothing going on over there. However, they're telling us, they're warning signs, and they're telling us something about the direction in which our society is moving. And that I cannot find a more apt word for it other than catastrophe. The other word that I've used here, which is the Anthropocene, which is the current era of human life. And the reason it is called the Anthropocene is because predominantly human activity here is determining climate patterns. So, you may have heard people talking about where you had the ice age, and then you had changes in that, etc., etc., so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm not really from a science background, so my use of scientific terminology will be limited. Those of you who are from science, please feel free to educate me later on. But the fundamental point is that there is a certain natural cycle of changes in global average temperatures, etc., etc., which have all shaped society. So there's nothing new about the fact that climate itself is changing, and this is often an argument which is forwarded to make us feel that this current era that we are living through of climate change is somehow not different. Somehow it is not really that important. Me and a lot of scientists, social scientists who are much bigger than me, who know much more than I do, would beg to differ on this. The difference comes in is that in the Anthropocene, whatever changes that you are seeing in the patterns of climate are predominantly the result of human activity. You can literally plot a graph. I mean, people have already done that, and you can see exactly when this started. And this happens around the time of the industrial revolution. So in many ways, industrial revolution has seen to have brought in a different society and eased human life in many ways. Eased human life, qualification being for those who can afford that ease. But it has been disastrous for the climate. And we've pretty much gone down that path with, some changes, but the carbon footprint more or less remains the same. It's not as if we've transitioned from an industrial economy to a financial economy and that has somehow reduced our carbon footprint. No, it's just we continue to have similar carbon footprint, but in different ways. So, in no matter which way you look at it, human activity is determining patterns of climate change, and this is very different from very natural changes of climate in the previous eras. Those were not determined by human activity, and I think that is the thing to remember. That is the argument to use to counter those who believe that nothing disastrous is happening over here. And this in turn then forms a feedback loop, because any change in your geological circumstances and the climatic circumstances is then going to determine the shape of society. It is that fundamental. It took several social science disciplines, including political science, international relations, sociology, history, quite a bit of time to see that ecology is fundamental to society. Even the slightest change in ecology is going to bring about massive changes, exponential changes in how society is operating. In fact, in economics, those of you who are from an economics background would probably be aware of this. Any ecological or natural inputs are referred to as externalities. Now, look at the use of the word externalities itself. That we are extracting from nature, we are able to operate simply because the climate makes it conducive for us to operate uh, as we are operating with all the benefits. And yet we are going to pretend that this ecology is somehow outside of our calculations of economics, or outside or external to our calculations of society. So even the manner in which ecology and climate change have been framed in the orthodoxy of disciplines is very problematic, and that's why mainstreaming talking about climate change is very, very important for us. We have to probably get rid of this artificial barrier. This is very, very fundamental. Now this is therefore becoming a problem that can neither be comprehended nor it can be resolved within a what is referred to as a business as usual approach of the human sense of time. And this emphasis on time that I'm putting is coming from two places at the moment. This is what I could think of. You are free to add to this. The first, according to me, is that human lives, they are a blip compared to the timelines of changes in nature. Changes in nature happen over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, and our lifelines are relatively short, definitely under 100 years. And this is a fact that modern life that we live has sort of made us forget. So we have this attitude that it's all right, this change is not going to impact me within my time. Whoever's coming next, well, they can deal with it. I will be dead and gone. And so it is not really my problem. So this concept of time can really mess with how and whether we want to have a dialogue on climate change or not. Now, you can see already when I say this that this is a very problematic idea, because you are essentially leaving the garbage for the next generation to clean up. And I'll come to another point later, and you'll see that a lot of youngsters around the world are very, very angry about this. Um, a second point, which is related to this idea of time, is that capitalism itself has further determined how time is to be used in such a way that any deviation from the current idea of how this time has to be used, from the notion of productivity that is constantly being on the hamster wheel of work, is seen as a threat. So you put these two things together, and you can think in terms of how the week is organized, how the work time is organized. I don't know if you're keeping up on the latest debates, but in many parts of the world now there is an increasing bid post this pandemic that instead of having a 5 or a 6 day work week, have a 4 day work week and give enough time for leisure, for rest, and for catching up on other aspects of human life. But as of now, we still, seem to want to operate within the older capitalist determined timelines. And when you see, put them together, you'll see that both these factors have contributed to a very lopsided understanding of the threat posed by climate change. Now, why do I say that? I say this because one, you do not have the time to think about the problem. Second, you do not have the inclination to think about the problem. The inclination bit is associated with the first point that I made, and the time bit is associated with the second point that I made. And most early, we'd we're either keeping ourselves or we are forcing other human beings who don't want to be part of that kind of a system uh, to be part of a system where looking at nature, looking at natural cycles, looking at how the ecology impacts human society is seen as a waste of time. And uh, waste of time is also a very interesting characterization, because you're essentially, looking at what is a threat to profit making, and you're reducing the intensity of that threat by referring to it as a waste of time, because obviously you don't want the current system, which might be working in your favor, you don't want that to be upended by any change in thinking about this understanding of time. And that's the sense in which I meant lopsided. And then further, it has blinded human society to the very basic fact, I've repeated this, I'll say it again, that messing with the ecology can have very, very disastrous consequences. um, a result of that, a very unfortunate one, is that the danger, although it was perceived and explicated many, many decades ago, but the action has been very, very tardy. If you read up the history of climate change, you'll find that experiments to, see the how much the global average temperature is rising. That has been going on, and also what are the consequences of this rise? That has been going on for a pretty long time now. But the acknowledgement at formal forums actually did not happen till the 1960s, 1970s. And even after that, conference after conference, and I'm not entirely disdainful of the conferences, but it is true that action has been very, very tardy. And so, following are some of the reactions that you see when you take a look at the global climate dialogue that is happening. Uh, One set of stakeholders is in complete deniers. So they are now referred to as the climate deniers, and a whole lot of them do not wish to or unable to understand what's happening for a variety of reasons. But I think the most insidious are those who probably have interests in the old economy, the fossil based economy. And so it would be in their interest to completely deny that this kind of a problem exists. And a lot of the deniers also use this argument that changes in climatic cycles is natural, so this is nothing to worry about. Then you have hedging, which means, you're sitting on the fence, you're not quite sure, or you don't want to be sure because then you'll have to take a position. So there's hedging. Then there's a third reaction, which is accepting the problem but refusing the solutions. And many states are doing that, which is unfortunate. One of the states, you know, guilty of this, definitely the United States. For the longest time, it was the US scientists who were at the cutting edge of finding out that such a problem exists. Uh, but they've been refusing so many solutions. It's not funny. Sometimes, the solutions are refused not because of any other reason, but they are just bad solutions. They are just not viable for a variety of people. Many solutions, especially those that are often sought to be imposed on, the mid-level developing countries, or sometimes even the poor countries, ask for massive economic sacrifices, and one does have to think about that. It can't. You can't really arrive, or you can't have a dialogue without including this aspect. And then a lot of the solutions are so technological and so technocratic that it seems like a pipe dream. I've been reading about something called solar geoengineering. I think that's the term. And it's a very fantastical sort of a solution. Um, the idea is to put these particles in the air using, aircrafts, which is going to cool down the temperature. Please read up more about it. So artificially injecting particles in the atmosphere, which will lead to a cooling of the atmosphere. Because, of course, the problem, it's called global warming. This is no longer, that term is no longer in use, but a lot of the orthodoxy continues to use the term warming. And so, what is the solution? Cooling. Now, if you study climate change properly, you'll realize that it is the average annual global temperature that is rising. But in terms of the consequences, you are having both, what we see in India, these terribly hot summers, or what you see in a lot of the equatorial African and other countries, horrible summers. But you also have events like the polar vortex, right? Which is increased cooling, right? So you have this very one-dimensional, artificially engineered solution, and this is a very dangerous solution, or in some ways, if you think about it, because if there's cooling where cooling is not required, you are again artificially changing the ecology, and that is going to have an impact on agriculture. It's going to have an impact on industry. It's going to have an, to give you an example from daily life, schooling, going to office, everything. So these are not terribly well thought of solutions, but they are very ambitious solutions, and you can see that this also requires a lot of money. So it's very difficult to utilize these solutions, and then that's very discouraging. And then there is the "we don't care, we'll be dead," which I've put out here as apathy. Now, there is, in the final analysis, there is definitely a small and a very vocal and a very sincere constituency which is clamoring for actions, but it is the task of Sisyphus. Nobody, it's an uphill battle. There's so many challenges at so many levels that it's very difficult, really, to for a small group to be able to bring about a notable change which will actually have a positive impact. So these are some of the reactions, and these are the reactions that have also got in the way of that tardy action, making it even worse. And then you have, a complexity. This is not a problem, but it is, I would characterize it as a complexity, that the number of stakeholders and their bundle of interest, it runs into multitudes. Let's not make the mistake of having, five or six monolithic characterizations of how many actors exist in the global climate dialogue, right? It runs into huge amount. Those small island poor people in small island countries would have very different interests from, say, rich people in small island countries. You take a country as ours with the kind of varied terrain that we have, you can say that the ordinary person is a stakeholder, but everyone's stake, depending on where they are and what they require, is going to be different. So this uh, complexity of the problem, I mean, even at a cursory glance, as you can see, is enormous. So how does the world um, reconcile this multiplicity of interests to resolve or manage this unique problem at a planetary level? Now, at this point, and this I come to the third and the final part of my presentation, which is dialogue for a planetary problem. I would like to draw your attention to a very profound speech given by renowned climate activist Miss Greta Thunberg. I'm sure you've all heard of her. It's literally impossible to miss her. Now, at a speech at Youth for Climate conference in Milan, and this was sometime in September, I think, last year, she said the following. She gave a brilliant speech. And what was that speech? It said, blah, blah, blah. And she said that at least three or four times. So and so, blah, 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 blah. Right? And at the end of that, this is what she said next. This is all that we hear from our so called leaders: words. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Now, yesterday, I was watching that a YouTube clip of this particular speech of hers, and I was just going through the comment section, and it's not just that, but there've been similar reactions in the media that I have seen. There is a fairly large constituency which does not take Ms. Tunbar too seriously, and two of the reasons that she's not taken seriously. One is that she's dismissed for being a child. Well, when she started her protest, she was definitely a child. She's still younger than a whole lot of us, but she's 16. So I think we can give some credit for that she's not entirely to be infantilized. However, that is not a view that a lot of people in the world share. And then she's also seen as a front for whoever is managing her, because, as a young person, she couldn't be pulling off these, presentations, etc., with heads of states, and it's such highfalutin forums on her own. So definitely there are people who are managing her, and both of these arguments are used to, sort of discredit what she says. You could have your own opinion about this. I would not interfere with that. However, I would say that, the what she represents in her constituency and the number of young people who have joined forces with her, I think they do form a very, very critical and a very crucial constituency. Um, for me, and maybe for a lot of other like minded people, the blah, blah, blah moment encapsulates a moment of sharp rage at the poor quality of dialogue around the question of climate change. Now, this is critical because nobody in their right mind would approve of forcible methods to deal with the problem, right? So, you wouldn't want coercive methods to deal with the problem. But at the same time, the quality of the dialogue is so poor that the only way to characterize it is a young person saying, blah, blah, blah. And I do not think that she is really quite off the mark. And yet, the quality of deliberation at every level, from local to global, and everything in between is very dense, very inscrutable, and has boiled down to very, very little. Um, so, this for me becomes a starting point to enter into what are the problems with the various or the nature of global climate dialogues which I have observed so far. The first is the very prohibitive formality. Now, as a student of international politics, I would not like to, it would be very churlish to dismiss the formal, legal, treaty based negotiations and dialogues on climate change. I would not want to do that at all. However, the formality, the strict rules of engagement, the prior approvals required by participants can make the formality acute enough for ordinary individuals to not want to take an interest. If you look at some of the language of the treaty, it's not really something that a regular person walking down the street would really wish to ex- engage with. And then of course, those who participate in these are go through formal channels, and so that formality also does kick in. Now, can you really hold a treaty dialogue, without formality? Absolutely not. On the other hand, can we at least acknowledge that there need to be channels to disseminate this formality in perhaps slightly easier, more comprehensible ways to a wider interested constituency? So the idea is to bridge the gap. It is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is not to express anger that, oh, this is also useless, so let's just stop hammering out treaties with formal processes. No, it is to have some kind of a bridge, but I'm flagging this as a challenge in the global climate dialogue. Then the next, who are the stakeholders? Now, for some earlier research had outlined some of the most influential groups that were in the formal dialogue. So some of the following emerged: the state and its representatives. And this is also not always, a monolithic category. The representatives, they are of various types, but they do, of course, converge on the official position and the agenda. For example, you could have bureaucrats, say, from multiple ministries in India, and also along with their political bosses. Then you have representatives from business and industry, which is a very large and a very influential category. Again, they're not necessarily a homogeneous grouping. Some are willing to do more, some are willing to do less, but do understand that profit would remain a bottom line. Then you have the scientific elite. These are the people who are telling us how and why this problem is happening. So they have to be, definitely have to be part of the solution. And their language is a completely different language. It's a language of science. So they are specialists, and they have a certain specialist language, which again is probably not intelligible to all. Then you have the security elite, because you're probably aware that climate change is now a security issue. It's ecological issues are not just something we do, when we have leftover time. Um, many countries, and if you do a very quick Google search, you'll find this, are now writing papers, formal papers on the security implications of climate change. So usually security specialists, they are often part of these dialogues. Then you do have civil society representatives. So it is not the case that civil society is not part, but even then, not everyone can access these forums. So certain civil society members who might be more influential, they might be able to participate. Those who might be doing a lot of groundbreaking work but are operating at very small local levels and probably don't have that kind of money, that kind of funding, may not be able to be part of this dialogue. So there is a certain gatekeeping, in civil society also going on over here. The next is social movements. Of all these, social movements, I would say, are the most democratic. They are the most inclusive. They are the ones that are structured, but not so tightly structured that it cannot be accessed by everyone. Um, is it a space for the everyday person? Yes and no. Why am I saying this? Yes, because this space, which is one of diffuse sites, timelines, and inclusive agendas, so it does elicit far wider participation from both the ordinary individuals, small sets of concerned students, citizens, as well as less well organized and marginalized groupings. Now, on the other hand, a large number of people also cannot access social movements. Um, I'm sure it's very difficult for, let's say, members of tribal communities belonging to central India, some of the most marginalized, to easily be part of social movements. They sure have very strong social movements, locally speaking, but is it always feasible or viable for them to, move out of their location, physical location, and participate in a lot of these social movements, which either happens in faraway urban areas or, in some other region, some other country? So there could be a problem over there. Even the composition of the movement and its leadership may be of a certain type and may not be of a certain type. So, depending on that, the participation in social movements can get limited, right? So this is definitely a much wider ambit as compared to, the more formal channels. But here too, we cannot take for granted that everyone is able to come in and put forward their point of view. Then, of course, you have the primary communicator, which is the media. The media, of course, of all types, is definitely the most powerful mode of communication on climate change. Now, you had, of course, traditional media, which print media and electronic media in the beginning. And, both of these were very, very slow to pick up on the issue of climate change. I can assure you that 20 years ago, any news related to climate change was just deemed as boring. And so it would simply not get either the newspaper column inches or, a front page or a prime time slot in the electronic media. It would not. It was seen as boring. It was seen as something that would probably lower readership, or people are not interested, so you can use the same space for something which is more exciting. And so even while the climate issue was a hot potato issue, and even when the negotiations of these issues was very, very intense, you did not find in the beginning a lot of great coverage, but that has changed over a period of time overall. The mainstreaming has definitely improved now, but I would still say that it's actually the internet and via social media that not only did the issue get greater traction, but this is also more conducive to the idea of the public sphere for a large variety of um, actors and voices to hold forth, right? It is a lot more democratic. If you have a social media account, right, you could just air your views. You could, talk about which side you're on. You could engage with people you don't know and who live far away but who are still influential, right? So it is definitely more democratic. Censorship is also relatively harder, which is not to say that censorship does not happen. I did not put it on the slide, but I am flagging it. It's definitely relatively harder here. But also, a lot of this conversation, it's not necessary that it gets automatically translated into action. There, you do have problems. So you could organize yourself and you could develop an agenda online, but finally the action has to happen on the ground. And that's where there are challenges. And the digital divide doesn't make it easy. I am, as an Indian, I am talking from the vantage point of a developing country. Those of you who are, foreign participants, and if you come from also developing countries, you would know what I'm talking about. That the digital divide is very, very crucial in our country. So you could be in the modern public sphere of the internet, and you could believe that you're making a massive change. But sorry, your voice is not resonating to the people who do not have smartphones, who do not have digital devices, who do not have the internet. And that is a fairly large proportion of our population. So you can see that the dialogue is hindered, it is enabled, but also hindered by some kind of problems. The obtuse language, no, very, very obvious. Um, a lot of the climate change discourse goes on in very technical and scientific language. It's very jargon laden. You should open some of the, the IPCC reports, or even other any report that you would like to see, and you'll see in practical alphabet soup. That's the nature of the problem. It cannot be helped. It is a scientific problem, right? But can we be creative and just find perhaps simpler words? And why do we have to invent words? Let's go down to the grassroots level and just see what the ordinary people are calling these phenomena. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's an environmentalist, and he's made a couple of documentary films on certain aspects of environmental issues in Orissa. And he mentioned to me that, in the social movements, people already have, at the village level, at the ground level, in different languages, people already have their own terms and words for a lot of what is going on. But what happens is that at the state level, we talk in certain languages, we talk at certain vocabulary, and there is no match between the two. So again, this is a gap which has to be bridged, and a lot of creativity would be perhaps required to bridge the language gap itself. Personally, if you ask me, one of the biggest problems that I face each time I pick up something related to climate change is to learn the new words, learning scientific technology, so that when I'm talking to someone else, to my students perhaps, I do not get the concept wrong, and really have to train myself to make sure that one uses the words very, very carefully. There's got to be a way to make that easier. It cannot be completely changed. As I said, it's scientific, so it cannot be completely changed. But also, we are not that shorn of imagination and initiative that we can't come to, some kind of a sweet spot where we are able to talk about climate change in a way that is more comprehensible, right? So, talking is the nature. So, from what I gather from all this, um, is that these are all very imperfect kind of dialogues that are going on. These are formal, yes, they're not entirely inclusive. Sometimes people are talking at cross purposes. There is a lot of conflict going on, so the dialogue is not perfect at all. But if you ask me, imperfection is not really the problem. The true problem is that the world ran out of time day before yesterday, and by that I mean that the problems overtaken us. I'm not exaggerating. The idea is not to frighten anyone, but a very realistic assessment. Um, Now, small scale and ground level dialogues, which are focused on science, on technology, ethics, viability, and inclusivity, all of these together. It's not that these have not happened; they are happening. Policymakers have been working on it. Independent, concerned citizens have been working on it. Groups of farmers who face problems with their productivity as a result of climate change, they've been doing all of this. And these are also dialogues which are replicable. It's not that you cannot have replicable dialogue. But what's the issue? This should have happened at least 30 years ago. The process should have started at least 30 years ago. So it is happening now, which is a great thing. But do we have that, kind of time? So now we find ourselves in a situation where, as a society, we are in a bind where we are finally, looking at creative methods for a deliberative way to pressurize states and the global community to act on climate change. But the window of time that's available to us is really, really frighteningly small in proportion to the disaster. So, in such a situation, what do? Do we stop the dialogue because we feel that it is futile? My answer to this would be an emphatic no. Retreating from the dialogue, it leaves too much power in the hands of the few, and it gives too much leeway to the perverse charms of coercive methods. So, this is a work in progress over here, which is to continue fine tuning the dialogue to enable further public pressure and to salvage an already battered society. With that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you all very much for your patience. And now I'd like to hand over the proceedings to Bezat for further.
Sure. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your presentation. Brilliant one, very informative. Now we open the floor for questions and answers or discussion. So I see Pragya has raised a hand, and anybody else who wants to raise a hand, please, wants to ask a question, please click on raise hand. Pragya, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Sucharita. I have 5 questions. I'm really sorry, but they are like really quick. And 3 of them are related. So the first is that, we always look at war as more anthropocentric. We never say that, so many forest covers were destroyed, or so much when nuclear weapons are tested, so much, or so many species have gotten, extinct. So we usually look at numbers, how many people died, or how many even livelihoods were destroyed. So it's always how do we use dialogue for for bringing out the other angles which are non-anthropocentric? So that's my first question. The second is that you were talking about this gatekeeping going on, that what changes are happening are essentially being pushed top down. So again, how do we use dialogue to kind of because the people who are suffering or the people who are impacted are more at the bottom of the pyramid. So how do we use dialogue to kind of or dialogue, or what are the tools available for us to kind of push their narrative? That's the second. The third is what I have been observing. There are 3 instances I'm going to talk about, are that during the dialogue processes, there is a lot of I would say blaming happening to a second party, to some other party, which sort of puts them more in a defensive mode. And the 3 instances I'm going to quote is that the East tends to blame, the more developed countries, that, oh, you have done this and now. And also East also kind of brings out that, we had minimalistic practices. We used to be like, we had more decentralization. We were more in the villages, communities, etc. By East, I also mean Africa, etc.
Yeah, sure.
So that is one instance. The second is, and a lot of environmentalists also tend to put individuals rather than focusing on I would say industries which tend to have a greater impact. And so, for example, a lot of vegans, like I'm a vegan, but I somebody asks me, what is your reason, or something like that, I would not guilt shame. I'll just say that if somebody asks me, is it good? Something I would just say, maybe try it for 1 day a week. But there are people who constantly guilt trip, and I don't see this as effective. And also in third is in terms of gender equality, a lot of times for individual, using diapers, for example, is shown as causing environmental damage. But what is not being considered is that it is the woman who does all the work, or most of the unpaid work. And so there is a lot of pressure on her to. So there's while we are sort of while all the points are made by people who are guilt tripping are completely valid, but I'm not sure if it works in a dialogue, and I would want to know your opinion, and also what is the alternative to that. So these 3 questions.
Wow, you grilled me very nicely. I would love it if you were to come and sit in my classes in Jamia, because there we have we run at least 2 papers on the environment, one at the BA level and one at the MA level. And a whole lot of what, the questions that you raised are things that we do discuss in the classroom. It's also very interesting for me because a lot of my students do come from rural backgrounds where the families are perhaps engaged now in agriculture, and they give me insights more than, me telling them things that are going on. But I'm going to try my best to tell you whatever I know. but you'll probably have to repeat. Your first question was about the fact that our discourse is entirely anthropocentric, which means that we are still talking about human beings and their fate on the planet, about the fate of human society on the planet, and we are not really talking about non-human species. So in the beginning, I had thought of including that as part of my presentation, but then I realized that just there be just it'll be way more than I thought, right? So I did not include that. But yes, that is an absolutely crucial part of any holistic solution. If not solution, then definitely an understanding from which the solutions emerge of climate change. I don't think we are at a point, where we can say that let's just save human society. And to me, this just boils down to basic science and that diagram of the life cycle and the food chain that we used to look at when we were in school. Those of us who've studied in India, our science textbook would always have that. And how could human society even exist, uh, disassociating itself from wider ecology that includes non-human species, whether you're looking at flora, fauna, you're looking at microorganisms, you're looking at all of that. But there's a slight technical problem. The technical problem with this, and this is when I teach the more legal literature on climate negotiations, that is where this comes up again and again and again. Who is going to speak on behalf of the non-human species? So there are large, vast constituencies that are not only not neglecting the non-human species, they're actively talking about the fact that our approach has to be holistic. It cannot be anthropocentric at all. I am also of the view. I have friends who are researchers in animal studies, who are doing this kind of work. But the reality is that it boils down to the fact that, again, even on behalf of the flora and fauna, it is the human beings who are talking, right? So then perhaps, and this is just an idea that I'm throwing out, um, is that as we are making changes in the discourse of the climate negotiations, one of the important changes that we make is that while we are talking about human society, we intensify the emphasis that we put on non-human species, and in a way that's already there, with IUCN, and talking about not just about endangered species but the rest of the biota also. It's there. I think the problem is that we don't talk about it, or at least when I read the about the negotiations, they are not being spoken about in the press. They are being spoken about as disparate issues. When we are talking at various important formal forums, there we increase the intensity, and in our whatever speech we have drafted, we talk about the non-human species as a very routine part of talking about climate change. I think that focus needs to become very, very crucial for this to end up becoming a non and for it to prevent it from becoming an anthropocentric discourse. So that was your first question. I'm sorry, please remind me, what was your second question?
The top down, and the how do we bring
the
the narrative to
gatekeepers,
the bottom?
right?
Yes.
So when I was talking about gatekeepers, I was talking about civil society. Now, in civil society, that there are groupings and organizations that are more powerful, more influential, and those that are not that powerful, not that influential, basically because they're on the ground, they don't have money, they don't have resources, not because they're not doing good work. So that is what I was trying to refer to, Pragya, that when we say representatives of civil society, which part of civil society is going? So every country has its super important civil society which are very crucial. And I mean, in India, for example, the Center for Science and Environment has done phenomenal work. Dr. Anil Agarwal, when he was alive, and Dr. Sunita Narayan, together they reintroduced terminology in the global discourse which didn't exist prior to that, right? So again, this is not to discredit any of their work, but it is simply to highlight the granular nature of social movements. The fact that not everyone is able to participate even if they wish to. Sometimes circumstances don't make it possible, sometimes funding doesn't make it possible. So when we are talking about a dialogue, what do we do then? I think I'm completely not a practitioner, so I could be completely off on this. But in my intuition gravitates towards greater political willingness and more diffuse sites of conversation, right? And to a large extent, that is already happening. We have so many, social movements in India itself. The fisher persons movements. We have the forest rights movements. There, these conversations are actually happening. I think they need to be picked up a lot more by people who go and represent at international forum. But I think more than that, it is not so much as whether the global dialogue is more important or the regional or the local is more important, but it is to keep it alive at all of these levels. I think this also will have to do a lot with the kind of quality of democracy and with the aims that have been achieved, right? Again, if you're um, you know if you're down to very everyday civil needs, and ecological needs are survival needs, but you artificially characterize it as not survival needs, then the political willingness to deal with these issues, to grant space to these issues, is going to be a lot less. That internal politics of the civil society will probably have to take care of these issues and make that space itself far more democratic. But having said that, no way to discredit the civil society in any way. I think they're doing a fantastic job. What was your third issue?
The third was the blame thing, which I gave 3 instances of the West being blamed. Yes.
Yeah. So as far as I'll take up the question of the West being blamed, because there's some other questions as well, but I'll take that. Now there, the fact of the matter is that the West is to blame, if you're going to use the word blame. There is in the negotiations, there is something called common but differentiated responsibilities. So it is a proper term within the UNFCCC, and in a lot of environmental discourse it is used, which basically says, very simply put, that who is responsible for this problem, this ecological footprint, this emissions in the atmosphere. So when you answer that question, you get the answer. Where did revolution happen? In Western Europe and in Northern America, right? So the minute you are getting that answer, the blame does lie over there. I tried when I was writing my PhD, I tried not to, to take a sort of an even-handed approach. Let's be very balanced and politically correct. But the fact is that the West is to blame. And when the non-West, which is countries of the developing South or East, as you said, they're not blaming. I would say they're asking for accountability, which I think is a very, very democratic thing to do. The Kyoto Protocol itself had this kind of an arrangement where it said that whoever is responsible for a greater proportion of the problem will contribute the greater amount of solutions, whether it is in terms of time, it is in terms of resources, it is in terms of money. And that is where the problem happened. Because India and China, if you look at their history of colonization, were not really responsible either for the Industrial Revolution, nor were they responsible for the emissions. Now, today they are responsible for both. That is true. But historically, the responsibility cannot be placed at our door. So I would say that more than blame, I would use the term accountability, because the minute you use the term accountability, then it changes the tone and tenor of the conversation that is happening. The minute you use the word blame, then it's okay, you are blaming me, then I can blame you back for a whole of things, which is exactly what happened, and which is the Kyoto Protocol sort of was one of the reasons why. So I hope that sort of answers at least part of what you were asking. And then you were talking about individual responsibility as well, right? You raised a question of individual responsibility and of gender. But the individual responsibility ship has sailed. I hate to say it, but we can all do what we like at the individual level, which would be very hard to do because it will involve massive changes in lifestyles, right? I mean, I'm talking to you on a computer, honestly. There is so much, that is ecologically damaging inside the computer, but if the computer wasn't there, I wouldn't be talking to you, right? So these are difficult changes to make. Are they impossible? No. I think we can, at the individual level, do a lot. But again, one of the things that must always be remembered is that these have to be democratic choices. There is a whole term called ecofascism, which insists that the environment, yes, has been damaged, which we know is true. Solutions have to be found, which we know is true. But the methods, they are uh, so coercive that they should not be acceptable in any democratic society. Now, what do we do then? Do we tell everyone that, here we are laying down a set of options and all of you have to do exactly that? That's not possible, because every individual leads a very, very different life. So there are some choices that need to make. And the only solution to that is greater awareness, greater awareness, greater awareness. And when, as a community, these changes happen, slowly the reluctant ones also tend to come along. And that is the point that we haven't reached. I think that's the point where we are starting right now. And the pandemic has made that very obvious, that as a community, we need to change our lifestyles. But if you're asking me, can individual action take care of the problem? I would say no. Because as you answered yourself, industry is to a large part to blame. What is the individual going to do about industry, which is a more of a structural problem, right? And what do? Do you shut down all the industries? So that's a practical problem, right? So there has to be a transition to low carbon. Today, if you take a look at Professor Navroz Dubash, he's written a blog on the website of Center for Policy Research. Please take a look at that. He's commenting on the budget, but essentially what he's saying is that we need to move towards a low carbon economy. So now these are transitions, that's going to take a lot of convincing and time. And that's where the problem is, that we don't have time that much. But I think that would be the way out, rather than we will, individual changes will happen. They're already happening. A lot of people are already making choices which are more deemed eco-friendly. That has to continue alongside, but that also cannot be coercive. And then you spoke about gender. I think you were talking about how products in the market make the life of women who are laboring much easier. So what do we do about that, right? Absolutely true. Firstly, you got that absolutely right. I teach like a whole segment on gender and environment, and women are disproportionately, any marginalized section would disproportionately bear the impact of anything negative that happens in society. So women definitely bear a greater burden, and because they labor so much, and the types of labor that they perform, that really, really impacts their lives, right? When there are changes in the natural climatic cycle, it impacts the household. And when the household is impacted, the woman's labor is impacted, and then the woman's life and her children's life, etc. Everything is impacted, and these are all mostly negative impacts, right? So I seriously doubt that every product on earth in the immediate future will become an eco-friendly product. I think we'll be living with mountains of plastic for quite some time to come. On the other hand, one does see innovations, right? If you're talking about, say, for example, let's take the example of feminine hygiene products. They're already coming out with eco-friendly options, right? So we are moving there. And I think what has to be done is to maintain, because um, going back to how we used to live without machines, etc., would make us Luddites of some type, and it's not very practical either. So we've got to get creative, and I think industry is getting creative. I think from the consumers also, there's a demand for more ecologically sustainable products, and maintaining that momentum will be very important to a complete transition. That's what I would say.
Thank you. I just have a very tiny comment for half a minute. When you talked about the Fisher movements, so I work on Indo-Pak, citizen to citizen peace, and there is a lot of in the Gujarat coast, there's a lot of pollution through cement factories, and because of which the fishes are kind of reducing. So fishermen keep going further and further away. And they enter as it is the territories are not demarked in the marine waters, and then they are they're imprisoned for a very, very long time. So I think a lot of these changes also affect peace.
This is exactly what I meant when I said that climatic patterns of climate change, anthropogenically induced, are changing the fundamentals of society. And it is not about whether you're just that's bad enough that we are breathing in horrible air. That's one part of the story, but the other part of the story is these kind of frictions that are arising.
Ravi Dubey is next.
Thank you, ma'am, for the presentation you have provided to us. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you are, Ravi.
Ma'am, my question was about the recent summit which held in the COP26. So, was it a success as compared to the other summits which had been in the past? And what's your take on the COP26? And we have seen that in the meeting there were many largest countries leaders who abstained from attending the meeting, such as from Turkey also and China. It was Russia also in the list. So, what's your take on that? The leaders of the most developed ones, those who have already developed, are somehow getting away from these kinds of summits. So, what will be your take? And then my second question will be that is the through this we can say that is the national interest coming in the way of the environmental protection, as the national interest they are taking into a wholehearted way, they are taking the national interest. No, this is my national interest, and I'm not going to decrease or whatever it is the changes I'm going to do. So what should we see in the coming?
Wow, thank you, Ravi. Fantastic questions. So as far as the COP meetings, as they are part of basically the ongoing process of the UNFCCC, right? And as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, that it's part of the formal dialogue, right? Now, formal dialogues are always like this because you are trying to arrive at some kind of a working negotiation, right? And whenever you're trying, whenever two or more states, like this large number of states, are trying to arrive at some kind of a working negotiations, the bar is often set low. The bar is to what we want to achieve in terms of climate solutions, how much participation we are getting, which is what you see at COP26, and all the COPs, in fact, and fine tuning, which aspect. The bar ends up not being very high if you study international relations and the more theoretical aspects of treaty making and negotiation. There you will see that very often, if the rules of the treaty are extremely tight, states will not participate, because they will turn around and say, well, this is not in my country's interest, I'm not going to go over there. And if you make it too relaxed, then a whole lot of people will participate, like in the case of the Paris Agreement. So large parts of the world are part of that, but it will practically give you no results, because those nationally determined targets, if somebody decides to set a very low target, nobody can do anything about it, right? So with a COP, I would say that there are no spectacular results, right? As I said, there's nothing spectacular, but as I mentioned, do we, because we are not seeing those spectacular results, or sometimes we are even seeing results that are very disappointing, do we stop the process? That, I think, you have the answer. You're nodding your head, so you have the answer. I think that's not such a great idea. Now, as far as the non-participation of certain countries is concerned, and that is the problem of any global dialogue, right? Even if you were to take, say, disarmament, etc., you will always see that this is part of the problem. But in this case, what that does is, as you've quite rightly surmised, what that does is that it's disappointing, and it pushes the debilitating consequences of climate change a little closer instead of pushing them away a little further. So yes, it is disappointing. What can I say? But this is where political will comes in. Now you see what has happened. There's a full-blown pandemic which is going on, a lot of which has practically stalled life as it is. And this is becoming yet another reason in among certain sets of people and among certain constituencies to not talk about climate change, because, well, we'll talk about climate change when we've taken care of the virus. Right. So you see how the process is moving and what kind of challenges are coming in its way. So yes, it is disappointing to not see countries participating. And that was the case, when, say, Russia or, Canada did not participate in the UNFCCC or the Kyoto Protocol. That's exactly how it was. So it is definitely very, very disappointing. It is dangerous also. But the dialogue must continue. The conference of the parties must continue as part of the treaty process. I always ask my students in class, when they are very disappointed, ma'am, United Nations doesn't do anything. Why does it even exist? I tell them, please close your eyes and imagine a world without the United Nations and its many associated bodies, would you like to live in that? You understand that it's not matching up to, the exacting standards that we would like. Would you like to live in a world where even these negotiations were not happening at all and there was zero movement forward? But I share your disappointment with our political leaders not taking the conference of the parties very, very seriously. So even when in the media, the conference of the parties is often declared a success, I would take that with a big pinch of salt.
And so, as we talked about the UN, so is it like that it is more inclined toward West and less toward the South? It is more for the West and less for the South.
Yeah, some of the agencies of the UN, naturally because of their funding and participation, to a great extent would not be terribly equal forums like the Security Council. Definitely would not be. But you do have forums like the General Assembly where, countries that are not very powerful still make a mark. So I would not be entirely pessimistic on that count. I would not, because if you didn't have the General Assembly, just imagine, some of these small countries would not even get a voice. But here you have a situation where because of the existence of these bodies, especially the General Assembly, at their meetings, these countries get to, put forward their objections, which I think is a fantastic thing.
Is it that because of the democracy, the United Nations wants to give these small nations more space for them so that they can go?
That was the whole point of the existence of the United Nations, to democratize the international community. That was the whole point.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Arukya, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I think I had seen him.
I raised my question was on eco-friendly notion, and she dealt it already. And ma'am,
I'm sorry, could you repeat eco-friendly notions?
My question was on eco-friendly. So you have already dealt about it, but my question is on this. The whole problem of climatic change is based on two levels. One is at macro level, the other is micro level.
Okay.
In macro level, where we have all these developing countries come together, there is a huge amount of discussion, but yet they continue to exploit the ecology. For example, Africa and India, we become the garbage of the developing countries where they come and dump all the medical wastage and other things. And at micro level, for example, every individual is part of that micro level. And I'm quite happy using 2 bikes, three cars, and all the equipments that can really exploit the ecology. So both at micro level and macro level, there is a notion of treating ecology as an external object. Therefore, I can exploit as long as I want because it is an object outside me. So my question is, how can we really promote a notion of ecology being part of every individual?
Good question. I'll have to think very hard for an answer. But there is, before I get down to answering that, I think one of the most useful things that you have touched upon, which I probably didn't use that word, but I could say it now, is to look at this entire problem through also the lens of colonialism, right? The minute you look at it from the lens of colonialism, you put it together with the Industrial Revolution, the demands of raw materials, profitability, global trade, you're going to get a beautiful answer. It will be crystal clear. And a lot of what you are seeing is a continuation of the older patterns, because, those patterns have, through 400 years, 500 years of colonization, those patterns have been put in place, and post-colonial countries are kind of struggling to push back against them. But in so many cases, we have been co-opted because, well, we need to be participants in the global trade as well, right? And that puts us kind of at a position of, disadvantage. So I would say that, your question is absolutely apt. And if you search for answers through the lens of colonialism, you will get very, very good answers. I could go very deep into it, but I don't want to, because then it'll just be all over the place. But that is where I would start. And how do you promote? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. how do we promote? By doing the kind of things that we are doing, let's say in this certificate course, by including a module on ecology. Maybe some of you, are already aware of the problems, but there are always people, who don't know that much. So it's good to have these kind of conversations. On my part, by mainstreaming environment as a subject to be taught at the undergraduate, postgraduate level, and as a subject to be researched at the M.Phil and PhD level, that is my way of pushing and promoting. But also look at, Future for Fridays, those kind of organizations which are doing internet advocacy run by much younger people. Also do not ignore, the PARI network or, the works of the older so-called development journalists or environmentalists. So there is a vast network of people in professions who are already pushing the case for not seeing ecology as an externality, but there will always be a category of the orthodoxy which will not want to, or I'd not say that not want to, but which is perfectly comfortable in the status quo, right? Now, how do we battle that? That's the big question. Again, I'm not in favor of coercive means. So for me, it would be, having greater dialogue conversation among my peers, particularly, and, having greater conversation and dialogues with, say, your generation, with the next generation. That would be my way, because I see the change happening over there. I'm finding it very difficult to see the previous generation wanting to make changes. I see a lot of reluctance over there. Sometimes it's inability also. It's not just about reluctance. Sometimes you want to, but age can gravitate against making certain types of changes. Disability can gravitate against making certain very radical changes which are pro-environment, right? So then what do? You look to the future. You collaborate with the next generation. You mainstream the understanding of ecology. You don't treat it as a subsidiary subject. You treat it as something which is part of political science, which is part of international relations, part of sociology, part of economics. And that is already happening. That's already happening. And I'm really glad that, Bezad was kind enough to provide me a forum to talk to all of you about this, because to me, this conversation also becomes part of that narrative of pushing the case for ecology. And you've heard me. And so I'm sure that, when all of you move ahead in your respective professions and move within your respective communities, I'm sure you will take these sensibilities forward. And so snowballing, that's how it's going to happen. And like I said, through the internet, I do believe that internet and social media are very powerful tools to continue these conversations. And I do think that that's having an impact.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else? Do we have any more questions, comments? You don't really have to ask a question. You can also maybe make a comment about the topic. Pushpika, yes?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful session. Yeah, thank you so much. And I just have a comment to make. So, yeah, after that Afghanistan case, so I was also having the same kind of a questions regarding why these, bodies are even existing if they, nothing is happening, they're not doing nothing. And there are a lot of things, there are a lot of issues that are going globally, and I found that nothing is as such happening, but you truly answered these questions to them. So I'm very, very, very thankful to you for that, and thank you so much for the wonderful session once again.
Pushpika, I'm going to thank you, because I'm going to be a very happy person listening to you today, and that I was able to bring some clarification to you.
Yeah.
So thank you for that very generous comment.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anybody else? Any more questions, comments? Okay. So in that case, ma'am, we can conclude the session here. If you don't have to add anything. else. So thank you so much for your time, for joining us, and for this brilliant session that you had. The presentation was very nice, and also we had a very healthy discussion. So thank you to you. Thank you to all the participants. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the participants. And thank you so much, Bezad, for having me over. I had a really lovely time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.